Welcome to London Neighbourhood Histories, brought to you by LondonFuse and the Heritage Council as part of Doors Open London. During this audio tour, you'll have the opportunity to explore Old North. Much of the information in this tour is from the article London Neighbourhood Histories Old North, published on londonfuse.ca, researched and written by Vanessa Brown. LondonFuse's Neighbourhood Histories series highlights and chronicles a sliver of the rich, layered heritage of some of London's neighbourhoods, the diverse individuals who have lived within them, and the events that have impacted their development. The tour begins at the intersection of Richmond and Grosvenor Streets. We invite you to enjoy the tour from home or walk along the route we describe, taking time to pause and listen at your own pace. If you're listening to this tour while walking, please ensure you remain aware of your surroundings and follow traffic signals. Before we start the tour, we would like to acknowledge the history of the traditional territory and honor the long-standing relationships of the three local First Nations of this land and place in southwestern Ontario. What is now known as London, Ontario, is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Standing at the northwest corner of Richmond and Grosvenor, you can see the impact of the Sisters of St. Joseph quite clearly, with three of the four corners of the intersection home to St. Joseph's healthcare buildings. Some of the most significant developments in Old North came from the initiatives of the Sisters of St. Joseph, Catholic nuns who first arrived in London in 1868 at the request of the local Bishop John Walsh. They lived in a convent near St. Peter's Basilica in downtown London. Their first project was the Mount Hope Orphanage, which opened in 1869 in the former residence of London Mayor William Barker on the southwest corner of Grosvenor and Richmond Streets. The estate was large with gardens and orchards, which were eventually torn out to build an addition for the children. The nuns made their own bread and the children assisted in gathering water from the river and the well. There was a stable with a horse and a cow. In 1877, another addition to the building was made to house elderly citizens in need, and the compound quickly began to modernize. Soon, there were too many children for the size of the facility, so they were moved to Mount St. Joseph Orphanage, which opened on April 29, 1900 at 1486 Richmond Street near Windermere. Head east on Grosvenor towards St. George Street as we tell you more about St. Joseph's. This orphanage was in use until the 1950s when the government took over childcare services. The previous orphanage, Mount Hope, was used for the elderly until it was torn down in 1963 to make way for a new facility to care for the aged, Marion Villa. Now called the Mount Hope Center for Long-Term Care, you can see it to your left as you walk down Grosvenor. The Sisters also established St. Joseph's Hospital. The Sisters also established St. Joseph's Hospital, which is the hospital many London babies were born for decades and decades. The once familiar maternity wing moved to Victoria Hospital in 2011. The original 1888 building, now nearly impossible to see with all the additions and renovations, was designed by Moore and Henry, the same Moore family that would go on to create so many of London's other landmark structures, such as the London Life building on Dufferin Avenue. As you approach the intersection of Grosvenor and St. George, pause to look south on St. George down to St. James Streets. Did you know this spot was the beginning of Western University? When you think of Western, its beautiful 1920s buildings by architect John Moore come to mind, as do the stone gates on Richmond near Masonville. Today, it is a sprawling campus populated by about 30,000 students annually. It has a life all of its own. But Western University got its start in Old North. The original Huron College was at the corner of St. James and St. George Streets, founded in 1863 by Bishop Isaac Helmuth, the second Anglican bishop of the Diocese of Huron. Helmut was a Polish Jew who trained to be a rabbi at the University of Breslau. His theological descent, however, led to him being disowned by his father. He went to England for school, where in 1842 he converted to Christianity and entered the ministry in 1844 in Toronto. By 1861, he was in London and appointed as the bishop by 1871. It is rumored that his family has many tennis champions among them and were the first to bring the sport to the Forest City. Head north on St. George towards Cheapside Street. Helmut wanted to create an educational institution worthy of the schools he had attended overseas. Under the auspices of the Huron Diocese, Huron College had a campus that stretched from its buildings at St. James and St. George to Grosvenor Street and the Antler River. The students eventually moved to the present campus in the 1920s, and the old Huron College building stood until the 1950s. They were then demolished to make room for the apartments at 1 Grosvenor, which interestingly sports chandeliers from Hotel London in its main lobby. As you head north on St. George Street, you'll come across an infamous home in Old North, Thornwood at 329 St. George Street on the west side of the street. This beautiful Gothic revival house has a fieldstone foundation, 5 chimneys, a coach house, and an underground tunnel. It was built in 1852 by Henry Corey Rowley Becker, who designed it himself. Well hidden from the street, the estate overlooks the Antler River, so what you see from St. George is actually the back of the house. In his time, Becker was so well known that what would later become Gibbons Park was at the time called Becker Island. Becker had some interesting family connections, including his cousin William Makepeace Thackeray and prominent relatives in the British Navy. These connections may have made it easy for him to befriend the Harris family of Eldon House, where he lived for his first 5 years in London, beginning at the age of 18 in 1835. At their encouragement, Becker became a lawyer and was active in city politics. As you reach Cheapside, turn right, heading east towards Richmond Street. Becker became a successful local investor in many business ventures. As a result, he constructed this manor where he and his wife hosted important figures like Sir John A. Macdonald, the Prince of Wales, and Winston Churchill, who planted a birch tree in the yard. Most of Old North was built in the late 19th century and early 20th century, despite being surveyed for development in the 1840s. During this building boom, many treasured architectural styles were used to create large, impressive homes for Londoners. It's a heritage buff's dream. The sidewalks are old and crooked. The oak and maple trees are enormous, towering over beautiful big homes named for romantic styles that roll off the tongue: Italianate, Georgian, Tudor, Gothic. In fact, the area contains over 180 of the city's heritage-designated homes. These are the city's most prestigious properties, continuing to attract affluent families to the wide and picturesque streets. Cross Richmond and continue east on Cheapside toward Wellington. At Wellington and Cheapside, you'll find a winter favorite of many Londoners, Doige Park. No Old North childhood would be complete without a day of tobogganing at Doige Park. Conveniently located across the street from an emergency room, now urgent care, for all those broken bones and bruises caused by hurtling down the steep slopes covered in ice and snow. Doige Park had always been a place for fun rooted in danger, as it was originally a gravel and limestone quarry called Anthistle Pit. Londoners started using it as a tobogganing and recreation spot well before it was established as a city park in the 1950s. Despite the industrial equipment and trucks, the constant use of the space by fun-seeking children gave way to safety measures and a more family-friendly setup. Turn right on Wellington, heading south to Grosvenor. As you get to Grosvenor, you are now in Bishop Helmut Heritage Conservation District, a shining gem in Old North's crown. Designated a Heritage Conservation District in 2003, its historic character has changed very little over the 100 years. Bishop Helmut was largely built up during a short period of time from 1895 to 1910, predominantly in the Queen Anne Revival style of architecture, a bold and decorative style that represented the optimism and energy of a growing and prosperous city in the early 1900s. Two churches, St. John the Evangelist on St. James Street at Wellington and the new St. James Presbyterian Church on Oxford Street East, provides architectural focal points for Bishop Helmut Heritage Conservation District. The district, named after Bishop Isaac Helmut, was also the site of the Helmut Boys College. Helmut Boys School was one of two private educational institutions started by Bishop Helmut. The other was the Helmut Ladies' School on Richmond Street near Windermere Road that became the Mount St. Joseph Orphanage. The boys' school grounds in Old North stretched from Wellington to Waterloo and Oxford to Grosvenor. When the college failed, Bishop Helmut converted it into Western University in 1881, hoping to offer studies in divinity, the arts, law, and medicine. The college, in need of repair, was occupied briefly, but the faculty survived and grew into the University of Western Ontario. The Helmut Boys College building was demolished in 1895. Thank you for joining us on this audio tour of Old North. We hope you enjoyed and learned something new about your neighborhood. London Neighbourhood Histories audio tour is brought to you by LondonFuse and the London Heritage Council as part of Doors Open London. Find more London Neighbourhood Histories at londonfuse.ca/heritage.